The old cooperage barrel was empty, but it was not light. Agnes dug the worn heels of her boots into the dusty ground, leaned back, and pulled. The wood, dry and smelling of decades of grain dust, scraped over the hard-packed earth, leaving a shallow trench in its wake. It was the 8th barrel she had moved that morning, and the sun was not yet halfway to its noon height. Her arms ached with a deep, methodical burn, a feeling she had come to associate with progress. She maneuvered the barrel into line with the others, a silent wooden army standing sentinel along the northern edge of the apple orchard. Each one was spaced just so, 1 barrel for every 3 trees, forming a porous wall of seasoned oak and iron hoops. From the ranch house, they looked like a mistake, like cargo dropped and forgotten. Up close, they felt like an idea. A fragile, heavy, and possibly foolish idea. She straightened up, wiping a line of sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, leaving a smudge of dust on her skin. The air was still warm, but it had a brittle quality, a thinness that hinted at the cold that was gathering somewhere up in the mountains, waiting to spill down into the valley. If you've ever felt the first real chill of autumn on the high plains, you know the clock it starts. It's a race against the inevitable drop, a season of preparation measured in shortening days and the changing slant of the light. It's a feeling that settles deep in the bones, a quiet urgency that the land impresses upon you. Agnes felt it now, a pressure that had nothing to do with the weight of the barrel. It was the pressure of the calendar itself. A horse trotted up the track from the main road, and she recognized the rider by his posture long before she could make out his face. Jacob, her late husband's brother. He managed the herd on the adjoining section, a man whose life was governed by the practical arithmetic of cattle and fences. He reined in his horse, looking from Agnes to the line of barrels and back again. He didn't dismount. "What's all this then, Agnes?" His voice was not unkind, but it was direct, stripped of pleasantry. It was the voice of a man who saw wasted effort as a kind of sin. "There for the orchard," she said, her own voice quiet, a little rough from the dust and the exertion. Jacob squinted at the barrels, then at the trees, as if trying to solve a puzzle with mismatched pieces. The apple trees were her own project, a small square of land her husband had always dismissed as orchard nonsense for him. The ranch was cattle. But for Agnes, the trees were insurance, a small but vital stream of income that was entirely her own. For what? Storing apples? Half of them looked like they wouldn't hold sand, let alone fruit. He was right. Several of the barrels had gaps between their staves wide enough to slip a finger through. The iron hoops on others were rusted and loose. They were rejects, discards from the land auction last spring. She'd bought the lot for less than the price of a single good one. Not for storing. For holding, she said. Holding what? You're being mighty mysterious, Water, Agnes said simply. She walked to the nearest barrel and ran a hand over the rough wood. It felt solid under her palm, a sleeping strength. Jacob was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the creak of his saddle leather and the soft snort of his horse. He was calculating something, the time it took to haul the barrels, the time it would take to fill them from the well, the sheer pointlessness of the labor. Agnes, he began, his voice taking on a careful, measured tone one might use with a person addled by grief or sun. The well is low. We need every drop for the stock until the autumn rains come. Filling these, it's a waste of time and a waste of water. I don't think it will be a waste, she said, not looking at him, her gaze fixed on the apple trees. Their leaves were already beginning to yellow at the edges, but the fruit, small and hard and green, still clung to the branches, promising a late but decent harvest. If they made it. It's your land, Jacob said, a note of finality in his voice. It was not an endorsement. It was an abdication of responsibility for the foolishness he was witnessing. He gathered his reins. Just don't come to me when the well runs dry before the first snow. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving Agnes alone with her silent, waiting army of barrels. She watched him go, then turned back to her work. She had one more barrel to move before she could start on the repairs. The ache in her arms was a steady, reassuring presence. It was the price of the idea. The idea itself had not arrived in a flash of insight. It had been a quiet accumulation, a series of small, unrelated observations that had slowly coalesced into a single, uncertain theory. The ranch was her whole world now, and she had learned to read its subtle language. She knew the way the dust devils danced on the flats before a windstorm, the specific shade of purple the distant mountains turned just before rain, and the hollow sound the ground made underfoot when it was truly, deeply dry. Her husband had been a man of grand plans and loud actions, but Agnes had always been an observer of the small and the overlooked. The ranch's greatest vulnerability, she knew, was not drought or blizzard, but a single night. A hard frost that fell too early, a sudden, silent killer that could arrive on a perfectly clear night in late September and turn a year's worth of careful cultivation into a field of blackened, withered ruin. The main pastures could survive it, but the orchard was fragile. The apples, still weeks from ripening, were the most vulnerable of all. A frost would freeze them on the branch, turning their flesh to a soft, useless mush. It had happened 2 years ago, wiping out the entire crop. That loss had been a hard blow, a winter of lean stores and patched clothes. It was a memory that drove her now. The origin of her strange project was rooted in a simple, daily chore, watering the horses. The large trough was made of thick cypress, set near the stone foundation of the barn. One morning last autumn, the first frost had arrived. She'd walked out into a world made of silver. Every blade of grass, every fence wire, was coated in a delicate, crystalline layer of ice. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Yet when she reached the horse trough, she noticed something odd. A faint mist was rising from the surface of the water, a ghostly steam in the frigid air. The water itself was painfully cold, but the air immediately around the trough felt different. It was still cold, but it lacked the sharp, biting edge of the air just a few feet away. There was a pocket of something less brutal, a tiny sanctuary of moderated cold clinging to the water's surface. She had dipped her hand in, and the water was like ice, but as she pulled it out, the air around the trough felt almost gentle on her wet skin. She dismissed it at first. A trick of the morning light, perhaps. But the observation stuck with her. A few days later, she saw it again. A puddle in the yard, shielded by a large granite boulder, was still liquid long after the dew on the surrounding grass had frozen solid. The rock, having soaked in the previous day's sun, was giving off a remnant of warmth, and the water had captured it. Water, it seemed, had a kind of memory for warmth. It held on. It was slow to anger, slow to cool. It was this small, tactile piece of evidence that had taken root in her mind. It felt less like a discovery and more like remembering something she already knew, something the land itself had been trying to tell her. Her husband would have laughed. Jacob clearly thought her mad. But the image of that steam rising from the trough on a frozen morning was more powerful than their skepticism. It felt like a clue. A weapon, perhaps, in the quiet, annual war against the cold. It was a weapon made of patience and water, and she was determined to wield it. The barrels were the means, the orchard was the battlefield, and the enemy was a temperature, a single number dropping below freezing for a few crucial hours. It was a fight that couldn't be won with fences or force, but maybe, just maybe, it could be won with 100 barrels of still water, patiently waiting to give up their stored warmth to the cold night air. The thought was so simple it felt absurd, but the memory of that devastating frost 2 years prior was a sharp and compelling spur. She would not let that happen again. Not if there was even a remote chance that this strange, laborious plan could make a difference. She had to try. She rode the 5 miles to Samuel's cabin the next day. He had been her husband's mentor and, before that, his father's. He was a man who seemed to be made of the same sun-cured, wrinkled leather as his saddle. He lived alone in a small shack by the creek, spending his days watching the sky and his nights, she suspected, remembering. He was sitting on his porch, polishing a bridle with a soft cloth, when she rode up. He looked up, his eyes a pale, faded blue, and nodded slowly. Agnes, it was both a greeting and a question. She didn't visit often. She dismounted and tied her horse to the rail, climbing the 3 worn steps to the porch. She didn't waste time on pleasantries, Samuel had no patience for them. She told him what she had seen, the steam rising from the trough on the morning of the first frost, the unfrozen puddle beside the sun-warmed rock. She described the feeling of the air, the subtle but distinct difference. He listened without interrupting, his hands never ceasing their slow, circular motion on the leather. When she finished, he set the bridle aside and looked out toward the creek, his gaze distant. "Water is a stubborn thing," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It holds what you give it. You give it sun, it holds the heat. You give it cold, it holds the chill. It doesn't like to change its mind in a hurry." He picked up a small pebble from the porch railing and rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. "Most things, when they get cold, they just get cold. The ground. A rock. The air. It's simple. They lose their heat and that's the end of it. But water is different. To turn from water into ice, it has to do more than just get cold. It has to throw away the last bit of warmth it's holding onto. It has to give it up." He looked at her then, his gaze sharp and clear. "When that water in your trough was freezing, it was pushing its heat out into the world. That little bit of steam you saw? That was the ghost of yesterday's sunshine, being let go. For a little while, right there at the surface, the water is fighting the cold. And the way it fights is by releasing warmth." The explanation was so plain, so devoid of scientific terms, that it settled in her mind with the weight of absolute truth. The ghost of yesterday's sunshine. That was it. That was exactly what she had felt. She was proposing to build an army of ghosts to stand guard over her trees. So, if there was enough water? She began, her own idea suddenly sounding more solid, more real. "A lot of water," he corrected gently. "And if it was spread out so there's a lot of surface, well, it might make a difference. A small one. Maybe a degree. Maybe 2 inches." He shrugged, a slight, spare movement of his bony shoulders. "Whether a degree or 2 is the difference between a harvest and a loss, that's for the good Lord and the almanac to decide. But the principle is sound. Water gives up heat when it freezes." He leaned back in his chair, the conversation apparently over. He had given her the fact, the piece of solid ground on which her theory could stand. What she did with it was her own affair. He picked up the bridle again, his attention returning to the familiar task. As Agnes rode home, the landscape seemed different. The dry grass, the dusty track, the vast, empty sky, it all felt charged with a new potential. She was not just a widow trying to save a few apples. She was a student of the land, learning its hidden mechanics. Samuel's words echoed in her mind. A degree. Maybe 2. It was such a small margin. On a mild night, it would be meaningless. But on a night when the temperature hovered right at the edge of freezing, that tiny buffer could be everything. It could be the difference between a black, ruined blossom and a green, living one. It could be the difference between an empty wagon and one laden with fruit for the market. It was a gamble, but it was no longer a blind one. It was a calculated risk, based on an observable truth. The work ahead of her no longer felt merely heavy, it felt purposeful. The skepticism of Jacob and the imagined laughter of her neighbors seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet authority of Samuel's simple explanation. The water would fight. Her job was to give it the chance. The first attempt began not with water, but with dust. The inside of each barrel was a landscape of its own, thick with the residue of whatever it had last held, flour, grain, salted fish, all of it now just a uniform layer of grey, gritty dust and cobwebs. She spent the better part of a day just cleaning them, tipping each one on its side, crawling halfway in with a stiff brush and a bucket, and scrubbing until the raw wood was exposed. The work was claustrophobic and filthy. Dust filled her nose and mouth, coating her hair and clothes in a fine powder. By evening, she was exhausted, but the barrels were clean, lined up like empty vessels waiting to be given a purpose. The next morning, she began the real test. She hauled the first 2 buckets of water from the well, the wooden yoke digging into her shoulders, and poured them into the nearest barrel. She was met with the dispiriting sound of a steady trickle. She peered inside. Water was weeping from a dozen tiny gaps between the staves, darkening the wood before dripping into the thirsty dust below. She tried another barrel, and then another. Of the 24 barrels she had hauled to the orchard, only 5 held water without leaking. The rest ranged from slow drips to outright streams pouring from their seams. Jacob's words came back to her. Half of them looked like they wouldn't hold sand. He had been more right than he knew. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over her. The sheer scale of the failure was daunting. The idea was one thing, the practical reality of these decaying, imperfect vessels was another entirely. She sat on an overturned bucket, the silence of the orchard pressing in on her. The sun was warm on her back, but she felt a chill. The project was impossible. The barrels were useless. The water, so laboriously hauled, was sinking into the ground, wasted. She could quit now. She could roll the barrels back behind the barn, admit defeat, and spend her time on more practical preparations for winter. No one would blame her. They would probably be relieved. But then she looked at the trees. The small, green apples were like promises hanging in the air. She thought of Samuel's words, the simple physics of it. The ghost of yesterday's sunshine. She would not be defeated by a few leaks. She was a rancher's widow. Her entire life was a study in repair. Fences, harnesses, roofs, pumps, nothing was ever new, and everything eventually broke. Her role was to mend, to make do, to hold things together against the forces that sought to pull them apart. These barrels were no different. They were just another broken thing that needed fixing. That evening, she rode into the small settlement that passed for a town. At the general store, she bought a small keg of pine pitch and 2 rolls of burlap. The storekeeper raised an eyebrow at the purchase. "Fixing a roof?" he asked. "Something like that," Agnes replied. The next day, she began the second phase of her project, not as a water hauler, but as a cooper. She built a small, controlled fire and set the pot of pitch over it to melt. The smell was sharp and resinous, the scent of waterproofing and preservation. While it heated, she cut the burlap into long, thin strips. Then, one by one, she addressed each leaking barrel. She worked from the inside, meticulously forcing strips of burlap into the gaps between the staves with the blade of a dull knife. It was slow, frustrating work. Some gaps were so narrow she had to fray the edge of the burlap to get it started. Once a seam was packed, she took a brush and painted the hot, sticky pitch over the burlap, sealing it in place. The black pitch smoked and sizzled as it touched the wood, creating a tough, flexible, and waterproof seal. She worked through the day, her hands becoming black and sticky with the tar. The sun beat down, and the heat from the fire was relentless. But with each sealed seam, her resolve hardened. This was more than just a repair, it was an act of defiance. She was reinforcing her idea, making it stronger, more resilient. By the end of the second day, 19 barrels were patched. She let them sit overnight for the pitch to fully cure, the dark lines of the seals stark against the pale, scrubbed wood. The army was no longer uniform, it was a collection of scarred veterans, each bearing the marks of its own salvation. The next morning brought a new kind of labor. Ben, the lanky young hand from the neighboring Henderson ranch, rode by as she was struggling to move one of the newly repaired barrels back into position. It was heavier now, with the added weight of the pitch and the lingering moisture from her leak tests. He reined in his horse, a smirk playing on his lips. "Morning, Agnes. You building a fort?" "Something like that," she said, not breaking her rhythm as she wedged a rock under the barrel to hold it in place. "Heard you were collecting barrels," he said, hooking a leg over his saddle horn. "Mr. Henderson says you're planning for a flood." I told him it ain't rained in a month. He watched her wrestle with the barrel for another moment. "What's with all the water, anyway?" "Looks like you're trying to grow a water orchard." Agnes stopped and looked at him. The name was meant to be mocking, but it had a certain rightness to it. A water orchard. That's exactly what it was. "Maybe I am," she said. Ben chuckled and shook his head, a gesture of fond pity for the strange obsessions of a lonely widow. "Well, good luck with your crop." He spurred his horse and cantered off, leaving the name hanging in the air. Agnes's water orchard. She didn't mind it. Let them give it a name. Naming it made it real. The true test, however, was filling them. The well was 100 yards from the orchard, 100 yards of dusty, uneven ground. The yoke with its 2 heavy buckets was a familiar burden, but repeating the journey over and over was a special kind of torture. Each round trip delivered perhaps 10 gallons of water. Each of the 24 barrels held 50. The arithmetic was brutal. It was a pilgrimage of sweat and strain. Back and forth, from the cool, dark promise of the well to the sun-baked barrels waiting in the orchard. The slosh of the water, the creak of the yoke, the burn in her shoulders and back, these became the rhythm of her days. She established a control group, a small block of 9 trees at the far western edge of the orchard, well away from the line of barrels. This was the part of her plan that felt the most scientific, the most deliberate. It was not enough to succeed, she had to be able to prove it. She needed a comparison, a patch of orchard left to face the cold alone. If her plan worked, the difference between the protected trees and this unprotected section would be her evidence. If it failed, well, then all the trees would be the same. The control group was an admission of doubt, a hedge against her own hope. It took her 4 full days to fill the barrels. For days of walking that same path until she felt she could have done it in her sleep. By the time the last bucket was poured, the water in the first barrel she'd filled was already still and gathering dust on its surface. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache. But as she stood back and looked at her work, she felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The barrels stood ready, full to within a few inches of their brims. The water within them was placid, reflecting the deep blue of the autumn sky. They had transformed from a collection of leaking rejects into a functional system. They were a battery, charged with the warmth of the sun, waiting for the command to release their energy. The mocking nickname no longer mattered. The skeptical glances from her neighbors were irrelevant. The orchard was ready. She had done all she could. Now, all she could do was watch the sky and wait. The waiting did not last long. A week after the barrels were filled, a rider came through from the railhead, carrying mail and news. He stopped at the Henderson ranch first, then made his way to hers. He handed her a letter from her sister back east, but his real purpose was to deliver a warning. A blue norther was coming. A massive front of Arctic air had broken free and was plunging south across the plains. It was still a day or 2 out, but it was moving fast, and it was cold. Not just autumn cold, but a deep, hard, winter-level cold, arriving weeks ahead of schedule. "They're saying it'll be the worst snap in a decade," the rider said, pulling his collar up as if he could already feel the chill. "Temperature's going to drop 50 degrees in a single night. It'll be a killing frost for sure." He tipped his hat and rode on, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence in his wake. The news spread through the valley like a grass fire. A quiet, frantic energy took hold. All up and down the creek, ranchers began their familiar rituals of preparation. Cattle were moved from high pastures to sheltered gullies. Haystacks were covered with canvas tarps. Burlap sacks and old blankets were gathered to be draped over delicate vegetable gardens. This was a known enemy, and the defenses were traditional and well-rehearsed. Agnes watched as smoke began to rise from the chimney of the Henderson ranch. They would be keeping the fire in the main house stoked, preparing for the bitter cold. She saw Jacob riding hard along his fence line, checking for breaks, making sure his herd couldn't wander and get caught in an exposed position. These were sensible, proven measures. Her own preparations felt, by comparison, passive and strange. Her neighbors were wrapping and sheltering. She was just waiting. That afternoon, Mr. Henderson rode by, his face grim with worry. He was a large man, accustomed to bending the world to his will through sheer force. He paused at the edge of her property, his gaze falling on the silent line of barrels. He had heard Ben's stories about the water orchard. He looked at Agnes, who was calmly checking the water levels in her barrels, topping one off with a final bucket. "Heard about the norther?" he called out. "I did," she said. He shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "A few barrels of water won't stop what's coming, Agnes. "You'd be better off spending your time covering those trees with blankets." It was meant as advice, a piece of practical wisdom from an experienced rancher to a woman he clearly felt was out of her depth. "This is how I'm covering them," she said, her voice even. Henderson grunted, a sound of dismissal. "Suit yourself," he rode on, shouting orders to Ben, who was trailing behind him with a wagon full of canvas sheets. The pressure to conform, to do the sensible thing, was immense. Every action her neighbors took was a silent accusation against her own strange, unproven method. As the sun began to set, the first sign of the front appeared. A line of dark, bruised-looking clouds massed on the northern horizon. The wind, which had been blowing gently from the south all day, fell completely still. An eerie, expectant silence descended over the valley. The air grew heavy. Agnes walked out to the orchard one last time before dusk. She placed a thermometer on a post in the middle of the barrel section and another on a fence post in her unprotected control group. It was the last piece of her experiment. She needed to measure the difference, if there was one. She laid a hand on the side of a barrel. The oak was cool to the touch, but she could feel a deep, latent warmth within the water, the stored energy of a week of sunny afternoons. It felt like a promise. The ghost of yesterday's sunshine, waiting for the cold. The sun dipped below the mountains, and the temperature began to fall. The change came just after full dark. A sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the orchard, whipping the branches of the apple trees and rattling the windows of the small ranch house. It was a cold, dry wind, carrying the scent of ice and distance. The blue norther had arrived. The temperature, which had been a mild 50 degrees at sunset, began to plummet. Agnes pulled on a heavy wool coat and lit a lantern. She could not stay inside. She had to be out there, to witness it. Her place was with her experiment. She walked out into the roaring dark. The wind was a physical force, pushing against her, trying to tear the lantern from her hand. The stars, which had been brilliant in the clear sky just an hour before, were now obscured by a fast-moving scud of low, dark clouds. She made her way first to the control section, shielding the lantern's flame with her body. The thermometer read 38 degrees. The leaves on the trees were already stiffening. The cold was sharp, aggressive. It felt like tiny needles on her exposed skin. She then walked the 50 yards to the section protected by her barrels. The wind was just as strong, but the air felt different. It was a change so subtle she thought she might be imagining it, a product of her own desperate hope. But it was there. The biting edge of the cold was slightly blunted. It was still deeply, profoundly cold, but it felt less raw, less violent. She held the lantern up to the second thermometer. The mercury stood at 40 degrees. 2 degrees. It was real. A 2-degree difference. It was the margin Samuel had predicted. She walked along the line of barrels, the lantern light dancing across their dark, wet surfaces. A faint, almost invisible vapor was beginning to rise from the water, torn away and scattered instantly by the wind. It was the process beginning. The water, now colder than the wood of the barrels but still warmer than the plunging air temperature, was beginning its slow, steady release of energy. It was breathing its stored warmth into the teeth of the gale. An hour later, she checked the thermometers again. The control section was at 33 degrees, hovering just above the freezing point. The protected section was at 35. The 2-degree buffer was holding. The wind howled, a constant, mournful sound. The world had been reduced to the roaring darkness, the small, flickering circle of her lantern light, and the numbers on her thermometers. This was the climax of her long effort, and it was not a dramatic confrontation but a quiet, cold vigil. She watched as the surface of the water in the barrels began to change. A thin, crystalline film started to form near the edges, a delicate lattice of ice reaching out from the wood. This was the crucial moment. The phase change. As the water turned to ice, it was forced to release its latent heat. It was giving up its ghost. She reached out and touched the air just above the surface of a barrel. It was unmistakably, demonstrably warmer than the surrounding air. It was a small pocket of resistance, a tiny thermal shield. All around her, hundreds of these small shields were now activating, creating a cumulative effect, a thin blanket of slightly less cold air settling among the trees. She had no idea if it would be enough. The temperature was still falling. By midnight, the control thermometer read 30 degrees. The trees in that section were now in a hard freeze. In the barrel section, the thermometer read 32. Right on the line. The surface of the water in the barrels was now almost completely covered in a thin sheet of ice. The heat exchange was at its peak. There was nothing more she could do. She had built the system, and now it was running on its own. She took one last look at the ice-skin barrels, at the branches of her trees whipping in the wind, and retreated to the house. She sat at her kitchen table, watching the lantern on the porch flicker and dance, and waited for the dawn. The dawn came slowly, reluctantly. The wind had died down just before first light, leaving behind a world transformed. A profound, crystalline silence had fallen. Agnes stepped out onto her porch and drew a sharp breath. Everything was coated in a thick, feathery layer of white frost. It clung to every fence post, every blade of dormant grass, every branch and twig. The world looked beautiful and dead, encased in a fragile shell of ice. The sun rose, a pale disk in a washed-out sky, and its light refracted through the millions of tiny ice crystals, making the landscape glitter as if it were strewn with diamonds. She walked out to the orchard, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. The silence was absolute. She went first to the thermometers. The one in the control section read 24 degrees. The one in the barrel section read 26. The buffer had held all night. The barrels themselves were frozen solid on top, a thick cap of ice sealing the water below. But the ice told its own story. It was not flat and smooth, but slightly concave, pulled down at the edges. The water had shrunk as it froze, a testament to the long, slow release of energy overnight. The true results, however, would not be visible for days. Frost damage is a slow reveal. The initial freeze is just the beginning, the thaw is what ruptures the cells and turns living tissue to black mush. There was nothing to do but wait for the sun to do its work. The waiting was a unique form of torture. For 2 days, the ranch remained frozen. The temperatures rose during the day but did not climb high enough to melt the thick frost. The orchard remained a static, glittering tableau. On the third morning, a warmer wind blew in from the south. The thaw began. Water dripped from the eaves of the barn. The white frost on the ground dissolved, turning the hard-packed earth to a slick, dark mud. This was the moment of truth. Agnes walked to the orchard, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She went to the control section first, forcing herself to look. The sight was sickening. The small, nascent apples were dark and soft. The leaves around them were blackened and limp, hanging from the branches like wet rags. The blossoms that had still been on the branches were completely gone, shriveled into nothing. It was a total loss. Every tree in the control section was barren, the promise of its fruit erased in a single night. She took a deep, steadying breath and turned, walking toward the long line of barrels. From a distance, the trees looked the same. But as she drew closer, she began to see patches of green. She reached the first row and stopped, her eyes scanning the branches. Many blossoms were blackened here, too. Her heart sank. It hadn't worked. But then she looked closer. Next to a withered leaf, a cluster of small apples hung firm and green. Further down the branch, another. She moved to the next tree, and the next, her gaze sweeping from branch to branch. A pattern began to emerge. There was damage, yes. The outermost branches, the ones most exposed to the wind, had suffered. But the inner parts of the trees, the branches nestled closer to the trunk and sheltered by the bulk of the tree itself, were largely untouched. The apples were firm. The leaves were green. She reached out and touched one of the tiny apples. It was cool, but it was solid. Alive. It wasn't a total victory. She estimated, walking the rows and making a rough count, that she had lost perhaps a third of the crop in the protected section. But 2/3 had survived. 2/3 of a harvest that, without the barrels, would have been a complete loss. It was a stunning, partial, and deeply satisfying success. She had not defeated the frost. She had merely negotiated with it, buying just enough warmth, just enough time, for the majority of her crop to survive. The ghost of yesterday's sunshine had been enough. A few days later, Jacob rode over. The thaw was complete, and the evidence of the frost's devastation was visible all across the valley. The leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek were blackened, and the wild plums in the gullies had dropped all their ruined fruit. He found Agnes in the orchard, methodically pruning the frost-damaged branches. He dismounted and walked through the control section without a word, his boots scuffing through the dead, blackened leaves that littered the ground. He looked at the barren branches, then walked over to where she was working among the barrels. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Here, the ground was not so littered. The trees were damaged but visibly alive, their green leaves a testament to their survival. He stopped and looked at a branch thick with small, healthy apples. He reached out and touched one, much as she had done days before. He turned it over in his fingers, feeling its solidity. He looked from the apples to the barrel standing nearby, its surface still showing a faint water line from before the freeze. He looked at Agnes, her hand stained from the pruning, her face calm. "I'll be," he said, his voice quiet with a grudging respect. It worked. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Agnes simply nodded, snipping off a dead twig with her shears. There was nothing more to say. The evidence spoke for itself. The true vindication, however, came a week later. She was mending a harness on her porch when she saw a rider approaching. It was Mr. Henderson. He rode not with his usual blustering confidence, but with a slow, deliberate pace. He stopped his horse at her fence and sat for a long moment, just looking at her orchard. She could guess what his own trees looked like. He had used the traditional method, covering them with canvas, but the wind had been too strong, and the cold too deep. The blankets would have offered little protection against such a prolonged freeze. Finally, he dismounted and walked to the fence, taking off his hat and holding it in his hands. He looked old and tired. "Agnes," he said, his voice low. He didn't look at her, but at the barrels. "My entire crop is gone." "Wiped out. I'm sorry to hear that," she said. It was true. There was no triumph in his failure. He gestured with his hat toward the barrels. "Ben told me what you were doing. We all had a good laugh about it." Agnes's water orchard. He finally looked at her, his eyes full of a weary humility. "It appears the laugh is on me." He was silent for another moment, gathering his thoughts. "I was wondering," he said, his voice dropping even lower, as if he were asking for a secret. "What kind of barrels did you use?" "They were rejects from the cooperage," she said. "Leaky ones, and the pitch?" he asked. "Did you seal them from the inside or the out?" She spent the next 10 minutes explaining the entire process in plain, methodical detail, the burlap strips, the hot pitch, the spacing between the trees, the need to leave a control group to be sure. He listened intently, nodding, his gaze fixed on the barrels as if they were monuments to a wisdom he had failed to recognize. When she was finished, he put his hat back on. "Thank you, Agnes," he said simply. He turned and walked back to his horse, his shoulders a little less slumped than when he had arrived. The next spring, Agnes saw Mr. Henderson's hands, including Ben, hauling old barrels into his own orchard. They were setting up their own small, silent army. Her idea, once a source of mockery, was quietly becoming the new wisdom of the valley. She looked out at her own orchard, the leaves a vibrant green, the blossoms thick on the branches. The barrels still stood in their places, a little more weathered now, the pitch seals glinting in the sun. They were a quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful forces aren't countered with strength, but with a patient, stubborn warmth, a defense built not of walls, but of the memory of a sunnier day, held in waiting.